He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why her dress was torn or why her hands shook when he lit the fire. All Luke Traeger knew was she was young, pregnant, and near dead when she collapsed on his porch during the storm. He gave her shelter, a blanket, a quiet place to breathe. But come dawn, 5 Apache warriors rode in out of the mist, bows drawn, blades ready, looking for the man who stole their sister, and suddenly Luke's past as an army scout was the only thing keeping him alive. The wind came first, dry, sharp, and smelling of iron. It whipped across the open mesa like a curse dragged out of the earth. By dusk it had turned mean, bending the pines on the ridgeline and rattling the old shutters of Luke Traeger's homestead like bones in a jar. Thunder followed, not distant but overhead, heavy enough to shake the tin roof and send the horses in the lean-to snorting against their ropes. Luke didn't mind storms. He'd ridden through worse, slept under worse. In all his 59 years, there wasn't much nature could do that would surprise him. It was people who did the damage, with their tongues, their fear, their guns. He set another log on the fire, the pop and crack of it filling the silence. His cabin was a single room, spare but clean. Cot in the corner, stove dead center, rifle above the door, all was loaded. A tin cup of bitter coffee steamed on the table. He didn't drink whiskey anymore. Not since New Mexico. Not since the thing, with Captain Rourke and that Comanche boy with the eagle feathers in his hair. Luke ran a rough hand over his jaw and stood, stretching the tightness out of his shoulders. His joints ached like they always did when the weather turned. He grabbed the old oil lantern and stepped toward the door to check the latch. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, a branch maybe, or a shadow thrown wrong. But the shape moved again, huddled, near the porch post, small, human, barely upright. Luke swung the door wide and raised the lantern. She was slumped forward, one hand pressed to her side, the other gripping the porch rail. Her dress, what was left of it, clung to her soaked frame in muddy tatters. Her skin was copper brown, her cheeks hollow, lips cracked and raw. But her eyes, they met his even through the storm, wide, defiant, Apache. Luke didn't move. Neither did she. Then her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the boards. She was lighter than she should have been, and under the folds of her ragged shawl, her belly pushed forward, round and hard with unborn life. Jesus, Luke muttered, lowering her inside. He didn't think, just moved. Years of soldiering, scouting, field work, it all came back in. Muscle memory. He laid her down on the cot, pulled the blanket over her, stoked the fire higher until the flames roared. Her face twitched once, then went still. There was blood on her dress, but not much. She wasn't in labor. Not yet. Still, she was bad off, ribs bruised, feet torn near to the bone, hair caked with dirt and burrs. Luke found his tin basin, warmed. Water cleaned the worst of the cuts. She groaned once when he touched her ankle, but never opened her eyes. He spoke softly, like one might to a wounded animal. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Just patching you up is all. Storm'll pass." She didn't answer. After an hour, he poured a cup of water and slid it near her hand. She didn't drink, but her fingers curled toward it as she drifted into sleep. Luke sat back in his chair. His eyes stayed on the girl. He should have been afraid. The plains were no man's land these days. Tribes shifting, soldiers retreating, settlers pressing in like floodwater. But fear was for younger men. Luke didn't scare easy anymore. He just felt tired. Tired and too old to be digging new graves. The girl woke once, sometime near midnight. The storm had broken into soft rain, pattering on the tin roof. The fire had died down to coals. She turned her face toward Luke, who was still in his chair, rifle leaning nearby but untouched. "You white man?" she rasped. He raised an eyebrow. "Mostly. What's left of me?" Her hand touched her belly. "Safe?" He nodded. "You're safe here." She didn't speak again, but for the first time she closed her eyes without flinching. Luke watched her until dawn. Morning came like a knife's edge. Mist curled off the hills, thick and low. The plains were quiet, the air too still. Luke stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the ridgelines. Old habits never left. The sun hadn't yet broken full over the horizon when he saw them. 5 riders, Apache. No mistake, they came silent, single file, like ghosts in the fog. No war paint, but their faces were grim. One rode with a bow slung across his back, another with a blade in his teeth. The leader wore a wolf pelt on his shoulders and a scowl that could curdle blood. Luke didn't move. The youngest dismounted, first knocking his heels into the ground like he meant to break it. "You got her?" he said in clipped English. "Our sister." Luke didn't reply. "She in there?" the eldest asked. Luke nodded once. "She came to me, hurt. I gave her shelter." The man's hand drifted to his knife. "She's not your woman." "No," Luke said calmly. "And I didn't touch her." The 5 exchanged looks. Speaking. Without speaking, Luke recognized that kind of bond. Brothers. Maybe blood, maybe just war-bonded. Either way, they were deadly. She was promised, the wolf-pelt man growled. To Chief Nantan, she ran. Luke exhaled through his nose. "She's pregnant." "You think she could run far like that?" "She dishonored the tribe." Luke's voice dropped low. "Looks to me like the dishonor was done to her." The youngest lunged forward. "You speak too much for a white man." Luke's rifle came. Up, not aimed, but resting on his knee now. His fingers didn't tremble. "I speak 'cause I scouted with your father, Red Tree, back in '62. I buried men at Fort Yuma, and I ain't about to let you spill blood on my porch unless you damn well mean it." The name Red Tree cracked the air like thunder. The eldest flinched. "You knew our father?" the wolf-pelt man asked. Luke nodded. "Rode beside him, carried his body down from the ridge when the Yuma rifles cut him to pieces." The tension shifted. Not gone, but changed, like a coiled snake deciding whether to strike. The youngest still looked ready to kill. "She ran from duty," he hissed. "She fled, lied, shamed us." Luke stood slowly. "She's a girl, carrying a child. Looks to me like she's already paid." Inside the cabin, she stirred. The brothers could hear her coughing, the rustle of the blanket, the clink of tin as she sipped from the cup Luke had left. The leader's voice was hoarse now. "Let us see her." Luke didn't move from the doorway. "If she wants to speak with you, she will. If not, you can go." That's when the knives came out, not in haste. In ritual, the sun broke full over the hills, and 5 blades gleamed with morning fire. Luke held his ground, eyes steady. The girl's voice, soft but firm, floated from behind him. "Don't." They all turned. She was standing in the doorway, one hand on her swollen belly, the other braced against the frame. Her face was tired, worn, but there was something steel-hard in her eyes. "I choose no man," she said. "Not Traeger, not Nantan, not any of you." The youngest stepped forward. "You bring shame." She didn't flinch. "Then leave me to it." The leader's mouth opened, closed. Then he bowed, just slightly, and motioned for the others to stand down. "We will speak again," he said to Luke. "This is not over." Luke nodded. "It never is." The brothers mounted. One by one they vanished into the mist. Luke turned to the girl. "You got a name?" She nodded, slow. "Sonali." He tipped his head. "Well, Sonali, looks like we both just started something we can't undo." Luke Traeger didn't sleep that night, not really. He laid down for an hour or two after the Apache riders vanished into the mist, but his eyes stayed open, listening to the coyotes yipping near the creek bed, to the wind in the chinks of the log walls, to the girls breathing just across the room. Even the fire made a sound, slow, dry pops like old joints, cracking. He couldn't decide what haunted him more, the sharp, wordless silence of those 5 warriors, or the way she'd stood her ground, Sinnily, she hadn't asked for his protection. Hadn't asked for anything, in fact, just the opposite. She seemed ready to face the wrath of her kin rather than be claimed by a man she didn't want. There was dignity in her defiance, but also danger. He'd seen too many things in his time to believe this was over. Blood like that didn't ride off and forget. They'd be back, and not just to talk. Luke sat by the fire and began checking his rifles. Sonali moved slowly, the next morning, like her bones were made of old rope. She stirred the stew he'd left simmering, her fingers shaking a little as she held the spoon. Her bare feet made no sound on the floorboards, but Luke could still tell where she was, not by sight or sound, but presence, like the feeling of a storm when it hasn't yet broken. Quiet, heavy. She sat at the table and didn't speak until he poured her a cup of coffee. "I don't know why you helped me." Luke shrugged. "Didn't think too hard on it." "You should have." Her voice was flat. Luke stirred his own cup, eyes on the dark steam rising. "Might be." "You're not like the others," he snorted. "That's just 'cause you ain't seen the worst of me." "No," she said. "It's because you have seen the worst of others." That gave him pause. He didn't answer, just sipped, then stood and walked to the window. The plains stretched out silver under the morning sun, quiet, for now. Sonali spoke again, later, sitting on the edge of the porch. She watched the land like she belonged to it, not in ownership, but in knowing, like the land trusted her. "I was given to Nantan when I was 12, she said without preamble. He was already a war chief then, 30 winters, respected, feared. He said waiting longer would dishonor his name." Luke sat nearby, silent. I scrubbed blood from his hands more than once, from other girls, from boys who failed him. She turned to face him. Her eyes were not red from tears. They were dry and dark. "When I was 15, I took a knife to my own belly to keep from carrying his child." Luke stiffened, jaw tight. She didn't stop. "They healed me, said I owed the tribe, so I waited. Until 2 moons ago when I saw him kill a young scout for looking at me too long. I left that night. And the child? Not his. Luke didn't ask who the father was. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen to live, and that choice had made her a target. Midday brought tracks. Luke spotted them first. Hooves circling wide, just inside the tree line. Scouts watching, testing the ground. He didn't say anything, just leaned his Winchester against the porch rail. Sonali noticed. "They'll come back?" "Probably," she nodded. "Then you should send me away." Luke glanced at her. "Where would you go? Does it matter?" "It does to me." Sonali stood, wrapped her shawl tighter. "You don't owe me, white man. This ain't your fight." Luke stood too. "You showed up bleeding on my porch. That makes it my fight, whether I like it or not." She looked at him for a long time, as if searching for the part of him that still believed in something. Then she nodded. "All right then. If we fight, we fight." They spent the next hours preparing. Luke reinforced the shutters, added extra braces to the door, dug out the second rifle from under the floorboards and checked the sights. He didn't have much ammo, a box and a half, maybe 40 rounds, enough to make someone think twice, not enough for a siege. Sonali helped where she could, hauled. Water, boiled beans, cleaned the blade Luke gave her. She moved slow, but with the focus of someone who'd known danger too long to waste time with fear. Late afternoon, she found a spot beneath the cot and laid out a small pouch of herbs and feathers. Luke didn't ask what they meant, but she noticed his glance. "For protection," she said. "Not just against them. Against the other kind of spirits." He nodded. "I've seen those too. They ate together by the fire as the light began to dim. "Why aren't you married?" she asked suddenly. Luke looked up from his stew. "Was, once." She waited. "Her name was Lorna. Died in the Colorado winter. We were crossing a pass too late in the season. I thought I could make it. Mule broke a leg. Storm caught us." "You blame yourself." "Yeah," he said softly. "I do." They sat in silence. Sonali stirred the coals. Then maybe this is your second chance." Luke didn't reply. But something in his chest cracked, just slightly, like ice under pressure. That night the first arrow came. It sank into the doorpost. With a thump. No shout. No warning. Luke moved fast, dragging Sonali away from the windows, yanking the shutter closed. He kept the lamps low, barely flickering. Outside, the night was still. Too still. Then a voice rang out, deep, guttural Apache. Sonali stepped forward. To the window, listening, translating under her breath. "He says I am claimed, that you defile me, that I bring shame." Luke kept his rifle trained on the dark outside. "Tell him he's wrong." She turned, eyes gleaming. "Would he believe you?" "No, but I'd sleep easier knowing you said it." She stepped to the door and shouted something in return. Her voice was strong, steady. The reply was not a word. It was a flaming torch hurled against the side of the cabin. It rolled, sputtered, caught the edge of the old pine logs. Luke moved, fast, smothering it with a wet blanket. Then the real assault began. For the next hour, it was war. Arrows thudded against the walls. A few slipped through cracks, slicing into the floorboards. One grazed Luke's shoulder, a thin red line that stung more than it bled. He didn't stop. He returned fire through the rifle slot, short, quick bursts. He didn't shoot to kill, just to warn, to hold the line. Sonali sat behind him, back to the cot, breathing fast but steady. Then silence again. No footsteps, no war cries. Just night. Luke crept to the door and opened it 2 inches. Nothing. Then a shape moved, low and fast toward the side window. Luke fired once. The figure dropped. He didn't feel proud. Just necessary. He turned back. Sonali was gone from her spot. "Sonali?" He hissed. She emerged a second later. From the shadows, bow in hand, one of his old cavalry blades at her waist. "I don't need hiding," she said. "I need a chance." Luke almost smiled. Almost. Dawn came slow, bloody, cold. The attackers had vanished by then, melting into the plains. They'd left 2 bodies behind, one young, one older, both taken with quiet respect and laid to the side of the trail. Sonali stood over them without a word. Luke watched her, watched the way her shoulders held firm even when her hands trembled. "They'll return," she said. Luke nodded. "Probably with more. They will not stop until I am dead." "Or returned," he met her eyes. "Then we don't wait here." She blinked. "You'd leave this? Your land?" Luke looked toward the mountains. Toward the trail he hadn't walked. "In 10 years? I've left more." She nodded once. "Then we go." He loaded the rifle. She tied her shawl, and they rode out before noon, one old scout and one defiant girl with a child yet to be born, into a world that still believed. Blood had to be paid, started something we can't undo. They rode into the canyon country at dawn, the light pale and uncertain, the kind that made everything look older than it was. Luke's horse, Dunbar, was steady on the trail, a long-legged gelding with scars on his flanks and a limp that came out in deep cold. He didn't mind the weight or the pace. He'd been through worse. Sonali rode behind on Luke's pack mare, a quieter animal, shorter and stubborn. She sat tall despite her condition, the shawl wrapped around her belly, hair tied back tight. She didn't complain once, not about the cold, not about the pain, but Luke knew she was hurting. He could see it in the way she held her sides every time the trail pitched downward. They didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said. By arrows, by fire, by the stillness that now trailed them like a shadow. Luke led them into the high ravines of Salt Rock Gulch, an old Apache hunting corridor he'd scouted 20 years earlier, back when his coat bore brass buttons and his orders came from men who never bled. Back then, the trail was lined with warnings. Stone stacks, feathers tied to scrub branches, bones left on the path. Now it was silent. No birds, no movement, just wind and memory. By mid-morning they reached the narrow pass, a slot between two rust-red walls of granite, only wide enough for a man to walk through sideways, but deep enough to swallow light. Luke dismounted and led the horses. "Why?" "Here," Sonali asked softly. Luke's voice was low. "Because I know where it leads." "To safety?" He gave a dry chuckle. "To something like it." She didn't ask more. They passed through the narrow. The world opened again, a hidden valley ringed with jagged cliffs and dry creeks. There were ruins here, old stone shapes half sunk in the earth, outlines of lodges and watchfires long cold. Sonali slowed her mount. "This place is sacred," she whispered. "A burial canyon." Luke nodded. "I know. You shouldn't be here." He dismounted and unsaddled the horses slowly. "Neither should you." She said nothing after that. Luke didn't explain further, just found a flat spot near a stone outcrop and began setting up a small fire. There was a spring nearby. He could hear it bubbling under rock. They'd refill water, rest the horses, patch wounds, then move again. He didn't trust any place. For long. Not anymore. Sonali wandered the edges of the ruins that afternoon, quiet and watchful. She stopped at a broken circle of stones, the remnants of an ancient hearth, and knelt there. Her hands moved lightly across the dirt, brushing. "Aside ash and time. I remember stories," she said suddenly. Luke looked up from where he was boiling coffee. "What kind?" "Of women who ran. Not from fear, but from knowing." She turned to face him. One of them once jumped from a cliff rather than be taken back to a chief she hated. The mountain swallowed her, but they say she lived, as a hawk. Her cries still echo in the canyons. Luke took a slow sip. "You believe that?" "I believe she chose." Luke let that hang there in the wind for a while. Then, "And what are you choosing?" Sonali's voice was quiet. "To be free, even if I have to die for it." He stood, walked over, set the cup down near her, and sat on a boulder. "You're too young to speak like that." "I'm not young," she said without blinking. "Not anymore." That night, the pain came. Sonali didn't scream. She curled on her side in the bedroll, fists balled in the blanket, breath short and shallow. Luke woke to the sound of her teeth grinding. He moved fast. Boiling water, laying down dry cloth, finding clean moss from the canyon spring. He didn't know how to deliver a child, but he'd held men together in worse shape than this. He knew how to keep someone breathing. She didn't want him near her at first. Tried to push him away. "I've got no choice," he growled. "You can hate me later. Right now, stay still." He dampened her forehead, whispered calm things he didn't believe. She bit down on leather and let the pain take her like a storm. But it passed. False labor. Not yet. Just the body warning what's to come. Luke collapsed back by the fire when it was over, shaking in a way he hadn't in years. Sonali spoke from behind him. "You could have left me. I know. Why didn't you?" Luke looked into the fire until the sparks blurred. "Because there ain't many lines left between man and monster. I've crossed most. This one, I figured I could hold." She said nothing. But in the morning she made him tea without asking. On the third day, the boy came, not the brothers, a lone rider. Luke saw him from the canyon rim, a thin shadow weaving through the switchbacks, young, bare-chested under a bone necklace. No war paint, but his bow was ready. Luke waited until he was close enough, then stepped out. "Don't," he said simply. The boy froze. His horse snorted. "She's alive?" the boy asked. "She is. I need to speak with her." "Not your call." The boy dismounted, walked forward, no weapons drawn, just eyes full of fear and fire. "I'm her cousin." Luke didn't move. "She saved me once, hid me from the U.S. patrols when I was a child. I never forgot." Luke studied him. "Then why are you riding with the ones chasing her now?" The boy's voice was bitter. "Because I had to. Because you do what keeps you breathing." He looked up at Luke. "But I don't want her dead. I want her free." Luke considered, then nodded. "Come on." The reunion was soft, not warm, not loud, just soft. Sonali didn't cry when she saw him. She looked at him like a ghost. He knelt before her, eyes cast down. "They say you defied the old ways," he whispered. "I did. They say you carry shame. I carry life," she answered. "There is no shame in that." He nodded. "Once. Then I ride with you." Luke didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Some people walk away from fire. Others ride toward it, even when they know it'll burn. They moved again the next morning, deeper into the canyon. Luke knew a place, an abandoned cave used once for storing seed and hides, dry, sheltered, high enough to see riders coming. Long before the dust reached the trailhead, Sonali was growing slower, heavier, breath shorter. The child was nearing. They needed a plan, they needed time, and both were running out. The cave sat halfway up a rock face that had once hidden buffalo from the world. A sheer climb guarded it, narrow switchbacks and handholds carved long ago by people who understood the difference between running and surviving. Luke Traeger knew the place well. He had camped there once during the Dry Wars, back when the only shelter a scout could count on was what he could remember from half-buried maps and ghost stories passed from Comanche to Cheyenne to Army mule train. The mouth of the cave opened like a wound in the cliffside, barely wide enough for a man to walk through upright. Inside it ran deep and cool, the floor dry and packed, the walls streaked with soot and ancient handprints, outlines of fingers pressed into the stone long before Luke ever took a breath. Sonali stood at the edge of the overhang, shawl drawn tight against the morning chill, belly round and heavy. She looked westward, eyes scanning the mouth of the canyon they had climbed through yesterday. The cousin, the young Apache boy who had come on horseback with dust in his throat and regret in his heart, sat cross-legged behind her, sharpening a blade with a flat rock and listening for birdsong. There were none. Luke didn't like it. He crouched near the fire pit and lit a small flame with pine needles and flint. The smoke coiled low, clinging to the rocks like it didn't want to rise. He'd been around too long not to notice signs, and every sign he'd seen in the last 12 hours said this quiet wasn't going to last, not with a child coming, not with warriors chasing a sister who'd broken tradition, not with him, an ex-scout who'd once tracked these very people into mountain passes and sold their whereabouts for army coin. He could feel it coming, something hard, something final. By mid-morning, they were preparing again. Luke handed the young cousin, who introduced himself as 10 Crow, a pouch of 45 rounds, and showed him how to anchor a firing line at the bend of the switchback. "This isn't about killing," Luke said. "It's about holding long enough to walk away." 10. Crow nodded, but his eyes were wary. "You think they'll come today?" Luke didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to the ridge across the way. "Tell me what you see." The boy squinted. "A hawk? Watch it." They did. For a full minute the bird circled, then dipped sharply, but didn't dive. "They're watching," Luke muttered, "or at least testing the wind. Scouts? Maybe. Or just a hawk. Doesn't matter. Point is, we act like it's real either way." Luke had spent too much of his life misreading signs. When it cost you a meal, it was just a story. When it cost you a man's life, it was a lesson. He didn't need more lessons. Inside the cave, Sonali was laying out old medicine bundles. She moved slow now. Each step seemed to weigh more than the last. Her breath caught more often. She winced. Sometimes, but didn't complain. Luke came in with 2 rabbit pelts and dropped them near the pile of firewood. "We need to talk," he said. She looked up. "About? Birth? What comes next? You're not going to make another climb like that again, not with labor coming." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then I stay. You go." Luke snorted. "Not happening. You don't owe me. You keep saying that like it's going to make a difference." She stood, or tried to. The effort took more than it should. Luke reached to help her, but she waved him off and leaned against the wall instead. "My people. They will not stop. Even if they have to wait, even if they have to come at night." "I know. Then why not run? Because running don't change anything, just delays it. He crossed his arms. Besides, I don't run well anymore. Sonalia gave a tired smile. You're stubborn. Only when it matters. That night the dreams came. Luke hadn't dreamed in years, not vivid ones. Not the kind that stayed with you after you woke. But this time, he saw them. Men he'd left behind in dry riverbeds, faces half-lit by torchlight, eyes covered with dirt, and Red Tree, the old Apache elder whose death still lived in the lines of Luke's hands. In the dream, Red Tree stood at the edge of the cliff and said nothing, only pointed to the sky. When Luke looked up, he saw a child falling through it, arms out, mouth open, no sound. Falling forever. He woke with sweat soaking his shirt, chest heaving. Sonali was already awake, sitting up, hands on her belly. He's coming, she whispered. Luke didn't ask who she meant. Labor began at first light. It started with low shuddering. Pain and grew into something primal, something that took Sonali's breath and voice and turned them into gasps and clenched fists. Luke moved quickly. He soaked cloth in the spring-fed water they'd stashed in skins, boiled what he could in the tin pot, kept the fire low but steady. 10 crow stayed outside, back turned, guarding the ridge with stone-faced stillness. It was not a clean berth. It never was. Sonali screamed once, just once, and then bit down on leather like she had in the cabin. Her body shook. Blood came. Luke had seen wounds, knife slashes, gunshots, disease rot. But none of that compared to the quiet terror of watching a woman fight death for life's sake. After hours, after what felt like 100 years pressed into a single morning, the sound came, a cry, thin, ragged, alive. Luke wrapped the child in a cotton shirt. Girl. Red-skinned and squirming, fists already clenched like she knew what kind of world she'd come into, Sonali fell back, nearly unconscious. Luke placed the child beside her. You did it, he whispered. But Sonali didn't. Answer, not right away. Outside, 10 crow called out. Luke rushed to the edge of the cave and looked down. Dust trails. Not 1, 3, riders. Full speed. Not scouts this time, not brothers coming to talk. Warriors, armed. Luke turned to 10 crow. Get inside, now. 10 crow hesitated. We fight? No, we delay. The boy frowned. They'll kill us. Luke looked him square in the eye. Then let's make 'em late to it. 10 crow sprinted up the narrow slope, breath sharp in his lungs. Below, the canyon rang with hoofbeats, the sound of war coming, not ceremony, not kinship. This was vengeance. Luke loaded the Henry rifle, fingers working without hesitation. His old army coat hung from a rock peg nearby. He didn't reach for it. Not because of the weight, but because he knew what it symbolized, and he was done wearing other men's rules on his back. Sonali stirred weakly behind him. Her face was pale, sweat beading along her brow. The baby lay beside her, swaddled in. Rough cloth, eyes shut tight, a fragile breathing truth Luke hadn't expected to see. A piece of someone else's future in a world still ruled by ghosts. You stay here, Luke told 10 crow. Guard them, I'll draw them off. You won't make it, 10 crow said. I don't need to, I just need to make them chase. 10. Crow's jaw clenched. No, we do it together. Luke stared at him, saw the steel underneath the fear, saw a shadow of who he'd been at 16, before regret carved hollows in his soul. All right, Luke said, but we move like ghosts. No gunfire unless they're on top of us. They slipped down the back of the cave slope, moving fast along the ridge path Luke knew from memory. An old goat trail winding past deadfall and loose shale. The sun crested behind them, throwing long shadows eastward. The riders were closer. Now, splitting off into 2 pairs, one angling toward the cave mouth, the other arcing wide toward the lower rise. Luke's breath was steady. He didn't think about dying. He only thought about distance, about time, about giving enough of both to let Sonali get through this night alive. They made the first shot count. Luke waited until the lead rider crested the saddleback, silhouetted against the pale sky, then fired once, not to kill, but to spook. The echo cracked through the canyon like a whip. The rider veered hard, lost footing, and the horse went down sideways, throwing up a cloud of dirt and stone. Shouts rose from below. Not English. Apache. Angry. Sharp. They'd seen Luke now. They'd commit. Now, Luke barked, and he and 10 Crow took off down the shale wash, scattering rocks behind them, drawing the pursuit west. The plan was simple. Keep them chasing. Lead them away. Every second they spent following Luke was a second Sonali, and the child might live. But nothing stays simple in war. The second pair of riders came faster than expected, cutting low across the gulch, one leaping a boulder, the other loosing an arrow midair that snapped past Luke's ear and buried itself in the dirt. Too close. Luke pivoted behind a stone outcrop, raised the rifle, and fired. The shot hit the rider's thigh, not fatal, but enough to knock him sideways. The horse kept running. The man didn't. 10. Crow spun and loosed his own shot. Smooth, perfect strike, with Luke's old revolver. The second rider dropped, gone. 2 down, 2 more now, angling around, and somewhere behind them, a fifth? Back at the cave, Sonali was not alone. She heard it first, the scuff of stone, soft, calculated. A shadow moved across the cave mouth. She reached for the blade 10 Crow had left her. Her fingers were weak, slick with sweat. Then a voice spoke. "Go, warn. I come alone." It was him, the eldest brother, Wolf Pelt. He stepped into the light, no blade drawn, no bow raised. Just a deep-set scowl and eyes that had seen too much. "I told them not to kill you," he said. They would not listen. Sonali didn't reply. She placed her hand gently over her child's chest, feeling the heartbeat. "I come now, because I have to know." "Know what?" she rasped. "Why you left us?" Sonali's face hardened. "You gave me to a man who beat me, who broke others. You honored him over me." Wolfpelt didn't flinch. "He was chief. He was a monster." Silence swelled. "I thought," she said, "maybe I was the shame, that I had brought dishonor. But I see now. It's not shame that chased me. It's fear. Your fear." Wolfpelt knelt, not in surrender, but in fatigue. "I followed the old ways. Then let them die with you." Outside, gunfire cracked again. Wolfpelt turned his head. "They fight for you," he muttered. "The white man, the boy. They fight for life," she said, "and we'll die for it." "Maybe," Sonali gripped the blade, "but you'll die first if you take one more step." Wolfpelt looked at her, long and hollow, and left. Luke stumbled back into the canyon mouth at dusk, blood in his side, coat torn. 10. Crow followed, limping, face blackened with soot and gunpowder. 2 more riders lay behind them, 1 shot. Dead, the other lost to the cliffs. "I don't think they're coming again," 10 Crow muttered. Luke nodded. "They weren't ready for a fight, just a lesson." 10 Crow sank by the fire. "You think they'll try again?" Luke looked into the cave, where Sonali now sat, child in arms, her body sagging but her eyes fierce and alive. He smiled. "Slow. No," he said. "They already lost." That night the canyon stayed silent. The wind shifted east, and for the first time in a long, long while, Luke Traeger slept without a rifle by his hand. The child cried at dawn, not loud, not panicked, just a soft wail that curled out of the cave like mist, thin, persistent, alive. Luke Traeger was already awake. He hadn't really slept, not fully. His body had rested, but his mind had stayed. Behind his eyes, watching shadows, waiting for hoofbeats that never came. He stirred the fire and poured the last of the grounds into the tin pot. The coffee was thick, bitter, and gritty, but it did the job. He wrapped his coat tighter around his side. The bleeding had stopped, but the ache ran deep now, bone deep. Sonali was awake too, cradling the infant to her chest. The baby girl was small but strong, fists always moving, breath steady. Luke had seen too many babies born too early, too frail. This one had fight in her. Her eyes had opened once last night, dark, deep, almost ancient. "You named her yet?" Luke asked, voice low. Sonali shook her head. "No name until the fourth dawn. It is not ours to give too early." Luke nodded. He understood that. Apache ways were strange to some, but not to him. He respected what he could, ignored what he couldn't. He'd learned the cost of ignoring too much. 10 crows out checking the ridge," Luke said. "Said he saw a snake trail. Might have been scouts doubling back." Sonali's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. Luke studied her a moment longer. There was something changed in her posture, not just exhaustion, a kind of stillness, not resignation, not peace either, something in between. "Are you waiting for them?" he asked. Sonali looked up. "I'm waiting for the truth." Luke didn't ask what she meant by the truth. Some things, if they were ready to be told, didn't need asking, and if they weren't, well, pressing only ever broke what might have healed on its own. He stood and stepped to the cave's mouth. The morning had gone pale and still. The sky was thin with cloud, no wind, just that eerie calm that came after the worst of a storm. His fingers brushed the rock beside the entrance, where soot and old handprints still clung. He wondered what kind of men left those marks. He wondered if they'd meant to come back, or if they knew they'd already left everything behind. Behind him, Sonali hummed, a low sound, not a song exactly, more like a rhythm she was borrowing from the earth. The child quieted at the sound, curling close to her mother's chest. Luke stepped out onto the ledge and scanned the gulch. No movement. 10 crow had left signs, little piles of rock, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, signaling the path was clear for now. Still, Luke's gut didn't ease. They spent the day gathering what little they had left. Water from the spring, roots from a stunted patch of yucca, the last of the dried rabbit meat. Sonali stayed near the fire, sleeping in short bursts. The child fed, slept, cried, fed again. Luke didn't hold her, not once, but he watched. Carefully, at one point, 10 crow returned and dropped to one knee near Luke. "There's smoke," the boy said. "2 ridges east, not ours." Luke didn't flinch. "How many?" "Hard to say, not a lot. Not a war band, but maybe watchers." Luke's jaw tightened. "Scouts," 10 crow nodded. "They know we're here, but they're not moving. Yet, waiting for orders," Luke muttered, "or for us to make a mistake." Luke stared into the fire, then said, "We don't give them one." The canyon changed after the parley. It wasn't louder or busier. There were no more riders, no more firelight on the ridges at night. But the silence felt different now, not tense, not dangerous, just empty, like a door had shut behind them. Luke Traeger felt it most in the mornings. He'd wake early, like always, still expecting a rifle in his hand or blood on the dirt. But each morning was just another dawn with the same sun, the same sounds. Wind, coals settling in the fire, and the quiet murmurs of a woman singing to her child in a tongue Luke didn't understand, but had grown to need. Sonali had grown stronger in the days since the parley. The color returned to her cheeks, her walk no longer bent her forward, and baby Tassa, small as she was, had lungs that could rattle the stones when she was hungry. Luke didn't ask what came next. Not yet. He spent his time patching the old fence. Down by the wash, cleaning the rifles, showing 10 crow how to shoot with both hands. There was a rhythm to it, the kind a man could disappear into if he let himself. One afternoon, Sonali joined him by the creek. She didn't say anything for a while, just watched the water crawl past the stones. Finally, she said, "You can leave, you know." Luke didn't look up. "That so?" "You've given more than anyone had a right to ask." "I didn't ask. What was fair? I just did what needed doing." Silence stretched. She sat beside him. "Tassa will need more than a cave, more than a fire and stories about the old world." Luke nodded slowly. "You thinking of going back?" "No," she said. "I'm thinking of building something new." The sound of hammers echoed across the valley by mid-morning, sharp, steady, hopeful. Luke Traeger stood near the edge of the north fence, holding a post while 10 Crow leveled it. 2 others from the new arrivals, the preacher and the freedman, were helping lay beams for a small storage barn. It wasn't much. Pine cut from the low ridge, bark still on it, roof yet to be nailed. But it was theirs. Every swing of the hammer meant another day they didn't have to ride on. Senali had taken to keeping records, not on paper but in memory, each name, each trade, each promise made. She walked the camp each day with Tassa in a sling across it, her chest asking questions no one else thought to ask. What food do you miss? What do you dream of building? What song did your mother sing to you before sleep? No one refused her, no one mocked her. They listened, and slowly the place began to feel like more than a hiding spot. It began to feel like home. It rained the day after Harlan rode out, not much, just a steady, whispering drizzle that softened the dirt and tapped gently on the patched roof. The kind of rain that made people stop and breathe a little slower, the kind that made the silence feel earned. Luke Traeger sat on the front porch of the homestead, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. His rifle leaned just inside the doorway, untouched. The war in his bones was still there, but for the first time in weeks, it felt far away. Across the yard, Sonali hung damp clothes on the line. Tassa, bundled tight in a sling, made soft noises against her mother's chest, one fist pushing gently against the fabric as if dreaming of flight. 10 Crow was out by the creek, checking traps. The preacher was oiling hinges on the chapel door. The smith's hammer rang out behind the smokehouse, steady as breath. It was, by any measure Luke had ever trusted, a good morning, and that's what unsettled him most. After the rain stopped, he made a loop around the perimeter. No tracks. No strangers, just earth turned soft by water and sky. He nodded at 10 Crow on his way back up the ridge, the young man grinning as he held up a fat rabbit caught in the snare. "Dinner?" 10 Crow said. "Bring it to the preacher. He's got the stew going." "Already did. He told me to get one more or go hungry." Luke chuckled. "Sounds about right." 10 Crow slung the rabbit over his shoulder and jogged downhill. Luke watched him go, then turned to scan the horizon again. Just habit. He knew the sound of trouble. Hoofbeats, raised voices, rifle clicks. But peace? That was harder to recognize. Peace was a baby's sigh. Peace was the way Sonali hummed when she thought no one could hear. By midday, the camp had taken on its usual rhythm. Children gathered near the bell to chase chickens through the dust. One of the newer arrivals, a woman who called herself Miss June and claimed she once sang on stage in San Francisco, was teaching 2 kids how to play harmonica. They were awful, but they were laughing. Luke cleaned out the shed and restacked the lumber pile. He found a pair of boots he didn't remember owning and left them on the chapel steps. Someone could use them. He was halfway through chopping kindling when Sonali came up beside him. "Quiet today," she said. Luke paused. "Too quiet?" "Maybe just quiet enough." He looked at her. "That sound like a good thing or a warning?" Sonali shrugged. "Depends on the land. Some places don't. Like to stay quiet long?" Luke nodded. "I've lived in those kinds of places." She watched him work for a moment. "You could stop," she said, "just for a bit. Never been good at that. Maybe it's time you learn." They sat on the porch together. For a while, watching the clouds break apart and roll east, Tassa slept in a basket at their feet, cheeks pink from the sun. Sonali rested her head against the post. Luke leaned back in the chair that still creaked when he shifted wrong. No one said a word for nearly an hour, and then Luke spoke, so quiet he wasn't sure he meant to. "I was 18 the first time. I killed a man." Sonali didn't react. He was older, Confederate scout, close range, bayonet. I remember the look in his eyes, more confused than afraid, like he'd thought we'd agreed not to meet that way. Sonali listened. Luke shook his head. 24 years ago, and I still dream about it. Not every night, just the ones when it gets too still." "Is that why you kept moving all these years?" she asked. He looked out across the fields. "I think it's why I never built anything." Sonali reached over, placed her hand on his. "You're building now?" That night, the sky opened up again, not with rain but stars. They ate rabbit stew by lantern light. 10 Crow played a cracked fiddle someone had traded for a hammer and a sack of nails. The preacher told a story about hiding from a bounty hunter in a coffin wagon. Sonali laughed so hard she nearly dropped Tassa. And Luke? Luke smiled without trying. 3 days later, a stranger came, not a rider, just a walker. Middle-aged, lean, eyes sharp. He carried nothing but a burlap satchel and a coat too thin for the wind. He stepped into the edge of camp and stood still. Luke approached, rifle across his back, but hands loose. "You lost?" Luke asked. "No." "You looking for trouble?" "No." "Then what?" "I heard about this place. Wanted to see if it was real." Luke studied him. "You got a name?" "Warren." "Warren what?" "Just Warren." Sonali stepped up, beside Luke. "What do you want here?" Warren looked at her, then at the baby in her arms. "Work, maybe a meal, maybe more if you let me." Sonali nodded toward the smith. "You work steel?" "I can learn." "That'll do." They gave him a cot in the grain shed, a plate, a job. He didn't speak much, but he never once reached for a weapon. The next few weeks passed with a quiet sense of movement. Not forward, not backward, just steady. Tassa cut her first tooth. The preacher carved a cross for the chapel wall. 10. Crow and Warren built a wagon wheel from scraps. Miss June taught the kids a new song. It was worse than the last, but no one minded. Sonali planted corn. Luke built a table with his own hands. They were doing it, not surviving, not hiding, living. Then one morning, a hawk dropped dead in the field. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Just dead. Sonali buried it near the fence. "Bad sign?" Luke asked. She shook her head. "No, a sign something has ended." That night, she sat Luke down and told him the rest of her story. The part about her brothers, about the knife she kept beneath her bed, about the fire she started that night in the chief's camp when she fled. Luke didn't interrupt. When she finished, she said, "If the price for peace is truth, you now know all of mine." Luke looked her in the eyes. "I knew it already." A month later, the first baby born in the settlement, not named Tassa, arrived. A girl born to a woman who'd arrived from Kansas with nothing but a tin cup and a wedding ring she never spoke of. The camp gathered outside the homestead. They sang, and Luke, who hadn't touched a Bible in 10 years, whispered the only prayer he still knew. "Let this be the place they don't have to run from." There's a way the wind moves when the land's about to remember something. It doesn't blow harder, just changes direction, carries smells, wet stone, dry sage, the faint iron tang of blood long washed away. Luke Traeger felt that shift. As he walked the edge of the field at dawn, boots brushing through the low grass that now grew in neat rows and wandering shoots. Summer was closing in. You could feel it in the dirt. It baked quicker, cracked louder. Even the birds went quiet. Sooner in the day, as if resting before the real heat came, Luke paused by the fence post, ran a hand along the grain. It wasn't perfect, nothing here was, but it stood, straight, strong. It would hold through wind and rain and time. Behind him, the settlement stirred. The forge hissed as Warren struck the day's first spark. 10 Crow was walking the ridge with his long rifle, careful but loose. Sonali's voice carried from the garden, soft and clear, singing to Tassa as she weeded the corn rows. This was what peace looked like, and Luke couldn't shake the feeling that it had come to test him. Here is the full text of Chapter 9, Dust. Settles where the heart stands still. Approx 3,000 words. Chapter 9. Dust settles where the heart stands still. There's a way the wind moves when the land's about to remember something. It doesn't blow harder, just changes direction, carries smells, wet stone, dry sage, the faint iron tang of blood long washed away. Luke Traeger felt that shift as he walked the edge of the field at dawn, boots brushing through the low grass that now grew in neat rows and wandering shoots. Summer was closing in. You could feel it in the dirt. It baked quicker, cracked louder. Even the birds went quiet sooner in the day, as if resting before the real heat came. Luke paused by the fence post, ran a hand along the grain. It wasn't perfect, nothing here was, but it stood, straight, strong. It would hold through wind and rain and time. Behind him, the settlement stirred. The forge hissed as Warren struck the day's first spark. 10 Crow was walking the ridge with his long rifle, careful but loose. Sonali's voice carried from the garden, soft and clear, singing to Tassa as she weeded the corn rows. This was what peace looked like, and Luke couldn't shake the feeling that it had come to test him. He tried to shake it off, the feeling, like ghosts, waiting for permission to knock. But it clung to his boots, to the calluses in his palms. The truth was, Luke didn't know what to do with peace when it wasn't hard-earned by blood. Not anymore. Still, the day moved like any other. Sonali harvested green beans and onions from the garden plot. Miss June was at the fire pit, boiling bones for broth and humming off key like it was opera. The preacher walked the camp with a book tucked under his arm, quoting bits of scripture to anyone slow enough to get caught in his gravity. Luke helped 10 Crow dig a trench near the barn for drainage. They didn't talk much. That was part of why they worked well together. By evening, the heat had settled into the bones of the valley, and most folks gathered near the central circle to eat and rest. Tassa toddled through the dust, chasing a chicken that clucked at her like it had old grudges. Sonali laughed and clapped her hands. The others joined in. Luke leaned on his shovel and watched. "Y'all look like a painting," he said. "Then you must be the frame," Miss June replied. "Or the dirt under it," 10 Crow added. It was near dark when the rider came, no thunder, no warning, just a single figure on horseback, limping down the far slope of Widow's Spur like he'd come 1,000 miles without blinking. Luke saw him first, then Warren. They said nothing at first, just watched. The rider made no move to shout, just stopped at the edge of camp and raised a hand. Luke stepped forward. "Evening," he called. "Is this Traeger's place?" the rider asked. Luke's fingers curled. "Who's asking?" The man dismounted. Lean, tired, dust-covered. Hat drooped low. "Name's Waylon Crowder. Used to run patrol with you out near Bent Fork. Long time ago?" Luke narrowed his eyes. "Crowder? Yeah. I thought you died at Red Mesa. So did everyone else." They stared at each other for a long time. Then Luke said, "Come on in." Crowder washed at the pump and ate in silence. He didn't look at the others much, just stared at his food like it might disappear. When he finished, he wiped his mouth and said, "Heard you were here? Heard you'd made something?" Luke nodded. "Trying." Crowder looked around. "It's quiet." "That's the idea. I ain't come for trouble." "Didn't figure you did." Crowder took a long breath. "But trouble might follow me." Luke didn't answer. Didn't need to. They talked late into the night by lantern light inside the half-finished barn. Crowder told him what happened at Red Mesa, how he took a shot to the ribs and got left under a pile of bodies, survived by pretending to. Be dead for 2 days until some Comanche pulled him out and nursed him for a season. "They said I owed them a life," Crowder said. "So I stayed, married one, had a kid." Luke stared. "You have a family?" "Had. Drought took her. Fever took the boy. I buried them both near a dry well with no name. Then I heard about you. Figured maybe peace still had a pulse." The Luke sat quiet. Crowder glanced around. "But if I stay, they'll come?" "Who?" "Old ghosts. Cavalry, maybe. Renegades. Folks who don't like peace without someone paying for it." Luke smiled bitterly. "We've been paying since the first nail hit wood out here." The vote happened the next morning. Crowder stood beside Luke as he told the people who he was, what he'd been, what he might bring with him. No one shouted. The preacher asked one question. "Is he running from justice?" Luke shook his head. "No, just from dying alone." Sonali stepped forward, then let him stay. The vote was unanimous. Crowder was home. Weeks passed. Crowder earned his place. He helped fix the Southern Corral, taught 10 Crow how to set tripwire alarms with empty cans and string, sang low songs in the morning, half in English, half in whatever language he'd picked up from the people who saved him. The camp changed again. Not bigger, just stronger. Luke slept deeper. Sonali smiled more. Warren and Crowder drank coffee in silence some mornings, not saying a word, but clearly speaking in some language of burdened men. Even the sky seemed to stretch wider. Then came, the fire. It started at the far edge of the valley. Dry grass lit by lightning or accident or maybe spite. Flames rolled down the hill fast. Angry, Luke saw it first and rang the bell. People moved like water, buckets, blankets, dirt. Sonali wrapped Tassa tight and ran her to the far edge of camp. Luke and Crowder stood shoulder to shoulder, beating flames back with soaked hides and wet shirts. 10 Crow fired a warning shot over a spooked horse's head to keep it from trampling a child. The sky turned orange, then black. Then it was done. They lost the chicken coop, one corner of the chapel, no lives, just breath and ash. Afterward they sat in the dirt, panting, blackened, half blind. Crowder looked at Luke. "You built something worth burning." Luke stared into the smoke. "And worth rebuilding." A week later, a letter arrived, delivered by a soldier who looked too young to have dirt under his nails. Said it came from the territorial office in Fort Clay, addressed to Luke. Inside, a formal invitation, testify about Crowder, confirm or deny desertion, or, the letter said, remain silent and be seen as complicit. Luke burned the letter without speaking. Crowder saw the ashes, said nothing. That night, Luke held Tassa on his knee while she drooled on his shirt, and Sonali sang a lullaby he still didn't understand, and he realized peace wasn't something you found. It was something you defended. Here is the full text of Chapter 10, What Men Carry and Leave Behind, formatted for copy-paste or download. A buzzard circled above Widow's Spur just after dawn, casting a long, slow shadow over the ridge trail. Luke Traeger noticed it while standing in the garden, turning soil with the heel of his boot. The sun hadn't yet burned off the cool of night, and mist still lingered in the low parts of the field. He straightened, wiped his hands, and watched the bird spiral. The buzzard wasn't circling for nothing. He'd seen that shape before. A slow tilt, a pause, then a drift to the left. That meant whatever was dead wasn't all the way still. Behind him, the sound of children's laughter rose near the well. Sonali was feeding chickens. Tassa waddled behind her, tripping and righting herself like she was learning how to walk the world on her own terms. Luke kept watching the bird, and then he saddled his horse. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't need to. Sonali saw him mount up and simply said, "Ride easy." Luke didn't ride hard. He didn't have to. The land knew him, and he knew it back. He followed the old creek bed up through the cottonwoods, then west around the split ridge, where the rock face wore petroglyphs too old for even the preacher to translate. The buzzard was still circling when he reached the bend that overlooked the basin. That's where he found the body. A man, face down, shot in the back. The horse nearby was still saddled, but grazing loose. No pack, no boots on the man, no hat. Luke dismounted and turned the body gently. He didn't recognize the man. Thin, sunburned, maybe late 30s, shot clean between the ribs. There were drag marks. Someone had rolled him, maybe looking for coin, or maybe it was meant. As a message, Luke checked the pockets. Empty. He stood and looked toward the horizon. Something had shifted. By the time he rode back into the settlement, the sun was high. Sweat clung to his collar, dust turned to paste on his neck. Crowder was waiting by the well, sharpening a piece of scrap into something blade-like. Luke didn't dismount. Just said, "Body near the basin, shot, no gear." Crowder's face didn't change, but his hands stopped moving. "Someone you know?" Luke shook his head. "Don't think so. Could be a drifter, could be bait." Crowder wiped the blade clean. "How far off?" "Half a day's walk. Less if you're desperate." Warren walked up then, brow dark with grease. "We putting up sentries?" Luke nodded. "2 on the ridge. Rotate at dusk and midnight." "Who do we wake if someone comes through the pass?" Ten Crow asked, stepping out from the shade. Luke looked at him. "Everyone." That night the camp didn't sing. The stew was quiet. Even Tassa didn't cry. Sonali sat by the fire, slowly mending a tear in Luke's shirt. Her hands moved like she'd done it 1,000 times before, even though she hadn't. Not for him. When he sat beside her, she said, "You think this is about Crowder?" "Could be." "You think this is about you?" Luke stared into the flames. "Could be." Sonali set the shirt aside. "You've done your part, Luke. You don't have to carry everything." He didn't answer because he didn't know how to put it down. 2 nights later, someone tried the fence. 10. Crow heard it first, a snap of wood, too deliberate to be wind. He gave a single whistle. Luke was out the door with his rifle before. The second one, they found prints. Booted, heavy, fresh. Only 1 set. But circling, testing. Luke knelt by the broken rail. The wire had been cut clean. Someone brought tools. "They were watching," he muttered. "But not ready to come in." Crowder stood nearby, eyes scanning the dark. "Scouts, measuring the shape of things." Luke looked at him. "Any idea who?" Crowder sighed. "Depends on how many enemies I still have breathing." The next day, Luke sent the preacher and 2 others into town, Fort Clay, for supplies and word. He gave them coin, told them not to linger. "Wear dust like it's armor," he said. "And don't talk to anyone with questions." Sonali watched the wagon roll out. "You trust them to come back?" Luke didn't look away. "I trust what waits for them here." That afternoon, Tassa said her first real word. "Mama." Sonali cried. Luke didn't know what to do except hold the child for a while, even though his hands were shaking. The preacher returned 3 days later, alone. His clothes were torn, 1 cheek swollen. "They know," he said. "Someone does." "What happened?" Luke asked. "We were followed, men in brown coats, no badges, no questions, just followed. And the others, they got out. But they won't ride again. Soon," Luke exhaled. "So they're coming." The preacher looked around the settlement. "They'll want blood," Luke nodded. "Then we give 'em a story instead." That night, the settlement held a gathering. Luke spoke first. He told them the truth, or most of it. Crowder's past. The warning signs. "The riders, we can run," he said. "Pack up, scatter, lose what we've made." He paused. "Or we hold," the camp murmured, not loud, just enough to show they were thinking. Zame and Ali stepped forward. "No one asked to be soldiers again. No. One came here to fight, but we've all lost something before. If we give this up now, we're choosing loss." Warren stepped forward. "I don't run." The smith nodded. "Neither do I." Crowder simply said, "If they come, they'll see who I became." Luke looked at the firelight flickering across the people he now called his own. "Then we build our story into the dirt," he said, "and we let them bleed, trying to erase it." The next day was for prep. They dug trenches, reinforced posts. 10 Crow laid traps, not to kill, just to warn. Sonali baked hard biscuits with extra salt. Tassa laughed at the sound of the bell they used to test the line. Miss June sang again, soft but full. It was the sound of people choosing to stay. And then the riders came, 3 of them at first, then 5. By dusk there were 9 at the base of the ridge, all with rifles, all with eyes too still for diplomacy. Luke walked to the fence with Crowder and 10 Crow. The lead man raised a hand. "We want the deserter." Crowder stepped forward. "He ain't here," the man snorted. "We know better." Crowder's voice didn't shake. "He died at Red Mesa, buried by his sins." "Then dig him up," Luke said. "You'll leave now." The man leaned forward. "You going to stop us?" Luke cocked his rifle. Crowder loaded his. 10. Crow didn't need to move. His aim was already perfect. The riders didn't charge. They waited, measured, tested, and as the sun fell, they faded back into the hills, not defeated, but not ready. That night, the camp didn't sleep. Luke sat by the fire with Sonali and Tassa. Sharpening his blade. "They'll be back," she said. He nodded. "But now they know," he said. "This land fights back." The ground stayed quiet for 4 days. No riders, no birds, no wind strong enough to move the leaves. It was the kind of silence Luke Traeger didn't trust, the kind that had weight, like the world was holding its breath before something broke. He walked the perimeter 3 times a day, boots leaving tracks beside the fence lines. 10 Crow kept his rifle cleaned and ready. Crowder barely spoke, but the way he watched the ridge said more than any words ever could. Tassa grew her second tooth during those 4 days. Sonali joked that she was getting fangs. Luke laughed, but even that felt like a borrowed thing. Everyone knew what was coming. They just didn't know when. On the 5th morning, the smoke came, thin at first, a lazy, meandering line rising from the north ridge, curling like a question mark into the blue. Luke spotted it before the sun fully cleared the treetops. He didn't call out. He just stared, counted the seconds between each shift in the smoke's shape. Crowder stepped up beside him, mouth set in a hard line. "That's not campfire smoke," he said. "No," Luke said. "That's a torch line. They're making a wall. To burn us in or to drive us out?" Luke walked to the bell and rang it twice. The signal for assembly. No one was late. They met in the clearing. The Björk mood was calm but firm. Everyone knew their part. Sonali moved the children into the cellar beneath the old grain shed. Miss June passed out jerky and water flasks. The preacher recited something under his breath, but loud enough that the little girl from Kansas could whisper along. 10 Crow and Warren took high ground. Crowder stayed by Luke. No one talked of surrender. No one mentioned running. They had done all that before. By noon, the smoke was thicker. The flames hadn't reached the edge of the fields, but the heat was coming. The riders hadn't shown their faces yet, but Luke could feel them, waiting, testing. It wasn't war they wanted. It was collapse. Crowder stood beside a makeshift barricade of barrels and fence posts. "You ever wonder if peace is just another kind of trap?" Luke shook his head. "Peace is the fight most folks run from." "Guess that makes us fools." "No," Luke said. "Just tired men who know better now." The fire didn't come through the north ridge. It came from the west. A break in the wind, or maybe a trick. But the first real crack of burning trees came just past the hollow where the smith kept her. Ore stock? Warren spotted it. By the time Luke reached the ridge, the orange glow was visible. 6 riders now. No uniforms, no flags, just rifles and hard eyes. "They're not backing off this time," 10 Crow said. "No," Luke said. "They mean to finish it." The first shot came before dusk, a warning shot. Wide, high. Luke didn't flinch. He stood in the open, rifle slung. Crowder stepped out beside him. "We ain't got numbers," Crowder said. "No," Luke replied, "but we got names." And with that, he raised his rifle and fired once, a shot that hit the dirt 3 feet from the lead rider's horse. It wasn't a kill shot. It was a line, and none of them crossed it. Yet, the fighting started in fits, a gunshot, a retreat, a rush through the trees. Luke kept the defenders tight, not chasing, not breaking ranks, just holding, just waiting. And every time the riders thought they had an opening, someone reminded them this wasn't a town to be taken. It was a choice being defended. Crowder took a shot to the shoulder. Didn't fall. 10 Crow hit 2 men off their horses from the rocks above. Warren was grazed. The preacher dragged him to cover, then picked up a fallen pistol and held it steady without ever having fired one before. Sonali never left the cellar, but her voice carried through the vents as she sang to the children, and that did more than bullets. By midnight, the fire had moved east. The riders had lost 3. The camp had lost none. But Luke knew it wasn't over. The hardest part was always what came after the first failure, when men were made reckless. By the taste of humiliation, that's when they got cruel. And cruel they were. At dawn, a white cloth was raised from behind a ridge. Luke held fire. A voice called out, "Parley!" Crowder swore. Luke stepped forward, alone. The rider who met him was younger than expected. Pale, thin, dirty blonde hair matted beneath a too-new hat. "We've come for justice," he said. "You're riding with ghosts." "He's a deserter. He's a man who found something worth staying for." "That makes him a liar and a coward." "No," Luke said, "that makes him human." The rider hesitated, then spat in the dust. "Next time we ride through, it won't be with offers." "Next time you ride through," Luke said, "it won't be out." The standoff held 2 more days. No shots, no charges, just tension. Then one morning, they were gone. Smoke trails on the far hills, boot prints in the dust, and silence. No one cheered, but people wept. Miss June quietly over the chickens. The preacher when he hung the cross back up over the chapel. Sonali when she sat on the porch with Tassa in her arms and said, "She gets to grow here." Luke said nothing. He just sat beside her and watched the wind finally move through the trees again. The days that followed were thick with silence, not the fearful kind, but the tired, deep kind that settles after a storm. No new riders came, no smoke on the horizon. The wind stopped warning, it just blew. Luke Traeger walked. The edge of the fields with his sleeves rolled and collar open, the sun warm on his back. He didn't carry his rifle anymore, not for the moment. Instead, he carried a ledger and a stick of charcoal. He was taking names. Not for a census, not for a tally, but for a book Sonali had asked him to start, a record of those who stayed. Because, if we don't remember us, she'd said, no one else will. And Luke agreed. Because names were a way to plant seeds in the world. The preacher helped him write. He had better penmanship. Miss June provided a little verse beside each name. Crowder, when asked what he wanted written next to his, just said, "I showed up." So that's what Luke wrote. Waylon Crowder. He showed up. 10 Crow, the one who kept watch, even when no one asked him to. Sonali, the woman who grew roots from fire. Tassa, born between smoke and mercy. And for himself, he left that line blank, not out of pride, but because some things you don't name, not until it's over. The repairs began slowly, one fence post at a time, one splintered window, one collapsed chicken coop. People worked with quiet hands and full hearts. There was laughter now, real laughter, not relief, not nerves, just joy. Warren rebuilt the forge roof with his own design, wide enough to catch the breeze. The preacher started teaching letters to the children, Miss June taught. A song about a frog with boots. Crowder planted corn, and Luke, he planted trees. 3 of them near the ridge, 1 for the woman who nursed Crowder at Red Mesa, 1 for Sonali's brothers, 1 for a child he never met, but once dreamed he might have had, long ago. A wagon came through in the 2nd week. A merchant from Topeka. He asked if this was the place where the deserter held off 9 men with ghosts. Luke laughed, then said, "No deserters here, just people who stopped running." The merchant left them with new boots, cloth, 2 crates of apples, and a promise to return. By nightfall, Tassa had juice on her chin, and Warren had eaten 5 cores in a row. Sonali kissed Luke on the cheek. He said, "I'm not going anywhere," she replied. "I know." The letter came 2 days later, hand-delivered by a courier dressed too clean to trust. It was addressed to Mr. Luke Traeger, guardian of unlawful lands. Inside, an offer, land deed, title, recognition. If you'll testify, if you'll—" "Kneel?" Luke read it once, then fed it to the fire. Crowder watched it burn. "Thought you might," he said. Luke didn't smile. Just said, "Some names don't belong on ledgers." That night they held a feast. There was no occasion. Just stew, bread, music. The preacher read from the book of Ruth. Miss June sang something soft and southern. Sonali danced barefoot in the Isla dust. Luke held Tassa in his arms high above his head and told her, "This is what free looks like." She giggled, and for once he believed it. Later, as the stars took their places, Luke sat alone by the fire. Crowder joined him. "Was it worth it?" the old scout asked. Luke didn't answer right away. He looked out over the field wet strata, the repaired fences, the swaying crops, the shadows of people who had chosen to stay. Then he nodded. "I think this is what a good death looks like," Luke said. Crowder grunted. "You planning on dying?" "Eventually. But not before the last tree takes root." Crowder clinked his tin cup against Luke's. "To the roots, then, to the ones who water them." At sunrise, Luke wrote his name in the ledger. Not on the first page, not bold, just quiet, measured, true. Luke Traeger. He chose to stay when the fire came, and he stood until it passed. The rain came on the third week, not soft and healing like the kind that kissed spring awake, but cold, relentless, and angry. The kind that turned dust to rot, made hinges rust, and soaked into bones until even hope caught a chill. Luke Traeger stood beneath the lean-to by the forge, watching sheets of gray wash over the valley. His shirt clung to his back, his boots squelched in the mud, and still he didn't go inside. He was waiting, not for the weather to pass, but for what always followed it. Because after drought came rain, and after peace came reckoning. Others stayed indoors mostly. Even the preacher, whose stubbornness matched Luke's, had finally taken shelter inside the chapel with his damp book and a cracked cup of coffee. Sonali and the women worked by lantern light in the storage barn, drying corn and braiding rope. Tassa had a cough, nothing fierce, but enough to make Luke's hand hover near her back whenever she wheezed. It was 10 Crow who spotted the first sign. Late on the 5th night, long after the sky had emptied its anger and the fire pit had turned to ash, he came running to Luke's porch, soaked and out of breath. "Fresh prints by the ridge," he said. "Rider, alone. Could be scout, could be bait." Luke didn't hesitate. He threw on his slicker and followed. They reached the spot in minutes. There, in the soft edge of the south trail, was a single horseshoe print. Deep. Too deep for travel. That horse had waited. "Any sound?" Luke asked. 10 Crow shook his head. "Too much rain," Luke nodded. "Could be someone testing us, or watching." Luke knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the edge of the print. It was still wet, but firm underneath. The rider had waited long enough to settle in. He stood. Slowly, time to move the line. By morning, the camp was back on alert. No drills, no speeches. Just the way a hand lingers near a hammer or a voice carries shorter when talking across an open yard. Luke posted guards again, rotating 3s, night and morning. Crowder returned to sleeping with his boots on. The ledger stayed locked in the Maya chapel drawer. The children stayed close to their mothers. And Tassa, she laughed less. The rider returned on the 7th day. This time, they saw him, alone, cloaked, face hidden by a low-brimmed hat. He didn't approach the camp, just circled the ridge once and rode off to the west. 10 Crow trailed him for a mile before losing the trail. He wasn't lost, 10 Crow said. He was learning. Luke grunted. "What do we do?" Sonali answered from the doorway. "We make sure he doesn't forget." Preparations began in earnest. The trap lines were rebaited. Barrels of pitch were rolled out to the fence line. Warren rigged a tripwire system using broken bells, horseshoe nails, and old boots. Miss June scouted the creek banks for escape tunnels. The preacher turned pews into shields. Crowder didn't say much, But when Luke found him one night sanding the stock of his rifle with his thumb, he asked, "You think they'll come this time?" Crowder didn't look up. They're already here, just waiting for the dark to look the other way. That night they lit every lantern in the settlement, not to keep watch, but to be seen. "If they're circling," Luke said, "make them wonder what we're daring them for." The effect was eerie. Warm light glowed from every window. Voices echoed calm. A baby cried once. Someone laughed. A hammer struck wood, and out in the dark, the watching eyes had to wonder if they were looking at a camp or a trap. Serenos on the 9th. Night. Luke dreamed of fire, not flames, but warmth. The warmth of Sonali's fingers on his chest. The warmth of Tassa's breath on his neck as she curled in sleep. The warmth of the earth after a long storm. He woke in tears, and when he stepped out onto the porch, he knew they were coming. Just before dawn, the first shot rang out. It cracked the stillness like a scream. Then came another, then 5 more. The ridge lit up with muzzle flash. Luke shouted, "Positions!" People moved. 10 Crow took the northern bluff. Crowder manned the entry path with Warren. The preacher and Miss June shepherded the non-fighters into the chapel cellar. Sonali didn't go. She stayed with Luke. "I'm not hiding," she said. Luke didn't argue. He just handed her a pistol. The riders came fast this time. 12, maybe more. No colors, no warnings, just death in the shape of men. They tried the east fence and triggered the pitch fire. 4 horses panicked. 2 riders thrown. Luke didn't watch them fall. He was already firing toward the western path, where 3 more came low through the brush. Crowder dropped 1. Warren winged another. 10 Crow from above picked off a man at full gallop, but still they came. The chapel took a hit. The bell was knocked loose and fell through the roof. The preacher, bruised but standing, picked it up and threw it at an incoming rider. He missed, but barely. Miss June screamed, not in fear, but in fury, and threw a pot of scalding oil from the kitchen fire. It hit square. The man dropped, shrieking. Sonali shot one man in the leg before Luke tackled him at the door. He didn't get back up. The battle raged into full dawn. Smoke and sweat filled the air. Warren was hit in the thigh, but kept shooting. 10 Crow had to fall back once when his perch gave way. Crowder took a slash across his ribs and didn't flinch. And Luke. Luke fought like a man who'd already died once and come back just to make sure no one took what he'd built. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just moved. Steady. Cold. Unstoppable. By noon, it was over. 8 riders lay dead. 3 fled. 1 was captured. The settlement had burns, bruises, but it stood. Tassa somehow had slept through the worst of it. And Sonali? She stood with Luke in the muddy yard, blood on her boots, baby on her hip, and said, "They'll come again." Luke nodded. "Let." They buried the dead in the north field, marked the graves with plain stones. Crowder said a few words. The preacher said more. Miss June sang a hymn. And then they went back to planting, because the ground was ready, because the season couldn't wait, and because after all the fire, after all the fury, there was still a future. Luke wrote a new line in the ledger. The longest night, 12 rode in, only the good stayed. Then he wrote one more name, Sonali. She stood in the storm and held the line. It wasn't quiet after the attack. Not really. There was the sound of hammering as the broken gate was rebuilt, the creak of the well when children pulled water for washing, the low, rhythmic scrape of a spade turning soil where blood had sunk. In and above it all, the wind, no longer cruel, but still constant. Still speaking, Luke Traeger didn't rest after the battle. He repaired fence posts, hauled timber, replaced burned shingles on the smithy. The muscle in his back ached so hard he saw sparks some nights. But he kept going, because after the gunfire, there was always a garden to tend. The preacher called it a holy rhythm, violence followed by creation. Miss June just said it was how folks stay sane. Sonali? She called it living. Tassa took her first real steps 3 days after the battle, straight across the dirt toward Luke. He didn't notice at first, was hammering a brace into the new porch railing, until Sonali laughed and shouted, "Look! Down!" He turned just in time to catch the child as she tumbled forward, arms out like wings. She pressed her forehead to his chest and said, "Dada." Luke wept, openly, for the first time since the war, and no one said a word about it. Warren, now walking with a cane, took over the forge in full. He stopped drinking coffee and started taking notes, measurements, experiments with new metal mixtures. He made a plow from old rifle barrels and the twisted frame of a salvaged cot. "This," he said, "is how we make peace useful." Crowder helped him shoot 2 horses. They never talked while they worked, but neither man seemed to mind. 10. Crow patrolled less now, but still walked the ridge at sunrise, just to be sure. Sonali planted squash. Miss June taught the children to sew. The preacher began writing. His own sermons, stitched from the earth and not just scripture. And Luke? Luke wrote. Every morning, before the work began, he sat under the old cottonwood and added to the ledger. Stories now, not just names. The woman who saved a boy from a burning bunkhouse. The man who stood his ground, even when his leg broke beneath. Him. The child who laughed during the siege because she didn't know what fear looked like yet. They weren't heroes. They were human. And Luke wanted the world to know the difference. Then came the letter. Not from the government, but from a woman. A woman who claimed to be Crowder's daughter. She arrived alone, on foot, dusty and quiet, asked for no coin, demanded no answers, just wanted to know, "Is my father the man you say he is?" Crowder met her on the edge of camp. They talked for 2 hours, then walked in together, side by side. She stayed. Started teaching math to the children, and Crowder, he started singing in the awe. Evenings, low and quiet, but songs nonetheless. One morning a wagon arrived from the east. 4 people. 2 goats, a caged hen, a boy with a violin. They said nothing, just looked around and said, "You've got room?" Luke nodded. They stayed. By month's end, 3 more wagons came. Some stayed, some passed through, but each left something, a story, a tool, a hand-carved spoon. And the garden? The garden grew, not fast, not perfect, but full. One night Sonali asked, "Do you think it's done?" Luke shook his head. "No, but I think we know how to begin again." She rested her head on his chest. "That's enough for me." And he kissed her forehead, and held her there, and felt the world finally make sense. The next morning the preacher handed Luke a package, wrapped in cloth, tied with hemp. Inside, the ledger, filled, every line, every page. Luke held it like it might break. "We need another." "The preacher said," Luke nodded. "We'll need 100. They buried the first ledger beneath the chapel floor. Crowder carved a box for it, lined it with scraps of iron and cedar. The children each placed a wildflower in with it, and when the dirt covered it for good, Luke said, "This is the record of what we became." That night the stars came out hard and bright. The preacher read his newest sermon. Miss June played her banjo. The boy with the violin joined in, and when Tassa danced on the porch steps, bare feet, thudding in rhythm with the song, Luke smiled, not because he was proud, not because he'd won, but because for the first time he realized he belonged. They called it a new season, but it felt more like a second life. Spring came early that year, cracking open the hard ground and coaxing out little green hopes from soil that once drank gunpowder and blood. The orchard bloomed. The corn took. The chickens laid steady, and for once no one watched the horizon. Luke Traeger had never lived this way. Without a pistol near the bed, without keeping one eye on the trail. But now his boots rested more often than not, and his thoughts drifted toward things like fences, stories, and the way Tassa's curls bounced when she ran across the garden path. He was no longer waiting to die. He was learning how to stay. Thus, Camp had changed, not just rebuilt, transformed. Where once stood fire pits and broken fences now grew hedgerows and wind chimes carved from bone and metal. There were benches under trees, carved initials in beams, laundry lines that snapped. Like flags on breezy days, children played without watching the adults for cues. The adults laughed without reaching for weapons. Miss June led song circles on Sundays. Crowder carved toys, small wooden buffalo, tiny horses, a set of painted dominoes. Warren taught forging to a teenage boy with a stammer who could barely lift a hammer at first. Even the preacher stopped quoting scripture so much. He wrote a book now, not about sin or salvation, but about what comes after survival. Luke spent his mornings walking the rows of new wheat and squash. He carried Tassa sometimes, or let her toddle beside him, chasing grasshoppers. Sonali joined him often, one hand tucked into the crook of his arm, the other resting over her. Belly, she was pregnant again. No one said the word out loud, but everyone knew. And in the silence, hope bloomed louder than any announcement. One afternoon, 10 Crow returned from a 3-day ride with news. New road's nearly done, he said. Cut straight through the basin. Stagecoach stopped coming. Luke sat with it for a long moment. Trouble? He asked. 10. Crow shook his head. Not yet. But growth always comes wearing boots. Luke exhaled through his nose. Then we teach them how to take 'em off at the door. A month passed, then another. Strangers began to visit. Traders, pilgrims, families chasing rumors of a place not on the map. Some stayed, some didn't. None were turned away, but none came in blind. The story had spread. The battle, the peace, the man who stood. With his back to fire and didn't move. They called him a sheriff, a preacher, a killer, a hero. Luke corrected none of them. He was just a man who stayed. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, written in rough hand, sealed with wax. It was from a Union officer, a man Luke once rode under, a man he once pulled from a burning supply wagon during the siege of Fort Morgan. The letter was short. I heard what you've built. They want to give you a medal. Say the word. Luke didn't write back. He folded the letter, placed it under the edge of the ledger, and went outside to mend a fence. Some honors don't weigh right when you've earned them the hard way. Summer came in heavy. Heat shimmered. Across the hills, the creek dipped low. Dust rose behind every step, but the corn held. The wheat ripened. The cabins stood tall and proud. Tassa turned too. She wore a crown of daisies and announced she was Queen of Mud. The preacher baptized 2 new arrivals. Under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Crowder passed away in his sleep not long after. No pain, no warning, just stillness. Luke buried him under the tree they'd planted together and carved a simple stone. Waylon Crowder. He showed up. He stayed, he rested. Grief came, soft, not sharp. Sonali wept for a day. Miss June sang louder. Warren built a bench near the grave. Luke sat on it often, said little. Just watched the sun move across the field and thought about the quiet ways. Men fight for peace. Tassa brought him pine cones, called them tree eggs. He smiled every time. The baby came early. A girl born with lungs like thunder and hands that gripped Luke's finger like she meant to never let go. They named her Ansa, Apache for answer. And in her cry, in Sonali's laugh, in the sweat-slicked air of that tiny room, Luke found something that didn't feel like penance. It felt like permission. One night, a stranger came through. An older man, ragged coat, soft voice, asked to share their fire. Offered a tin of tea in return. Luke nodded. Sit. They shared stew and silence. Before bed, the man said, I heard you were a hard man once. Luke replied, I still am, but now I'm hard to move. The stranger smiled. Then you're the kind of man we need more of. The next morning the man was gone, but he left the tin. Inside was a folded map with a circle drawn around, the settlement, and one word. Home. By fall, the garden doubled in size. Children outnumbered rifles. The chapel hosted weddings, not war councils. And the ledger, now on its third book, overflowed. Luke wrote every morning, every name, every story. He wrote about Senali's strength, Tassa's mischief, Ansa's wild hair. He wrote about Crowder, about fire, about fences, and forgiveness. And one morning, he wrote about himself. Luke Traeger. He did not run. He did not hide. He simply stayed, and the world changed around him. Zum